I think one has to be careful and wait for all the facts to be in. It's clear there was intense combat in the immediate vicinity of the UN compound. It was clear that there was very, as I say, intense fighting. It's not clear whose shells, whose fire hit the UN facility. It could have been ours, it could have been Hamas's. This is being investigated. I can tell you very authoritatively that every Israeli soldier going into combat knows, it's part of his orders, that we do not target UN facilities, we do not target UN personnel. With Hamas, as you know, it's very different. Hamas deliberately has a policy of abusing UN facilities and turning them into human shields for their military purposes.
Did you know that the United Nations compound was there? The UN are saying that they have heard that the general neighbourhood that they were in was under attack all night. They say they made repeated calls to you to call off the attack. Were you aware of those calls?
You know, a UN facility, it doesn't go back to yesterday or the day before. We have very good coordination with the United Nations. We know exactly where their facilities are. And as I say, our soldiers have strict orders, of course, to respect the neutrality of the United Nations. We, of course, fully support their humanitarian mission in Gaza. We're there to facilitate that mission. But as I say, the intensive fighting in the immediate vicinity of the UN facility, it's not clear today, was it Israeli fire or Hamas fire that hit that facility? I can only repeat once again, we know how Hamas operates. We know about that terrible incident at the school a week ago where Hamas deliberately brutalized a UN school, turning it into a human shield. Now, we don't know what happened in this case. We're investigating. We're meeting Mr. Ban today, the Secretary General. We obviously want to get to the bottom of this, and we want to have a good working relationship with the United Nations.
Well, the United Nations already seem to be pretty clear about who hit their facility. They say that phosphorus shells were fired into the UN compound. What do you say about that?
First of all, about phosphorus shells. First of all, Hamas has used phosphorus shells against Israelis. Let's be clear about that. And there was a lot of stuff out there a day or two ago about Israel using phosphorus shells illegally. I would point you to the statement put out yesterday by the International Committee of the Red Cross that said after looking into this issue, they found no wrongdoing whatsoever on Israel's part. Okay,
but you're saying with regard to today that you did not fire phosphorus shells into the UN compound because they seem pretty sure that they were dealing with a phosphorus fire, and of course only one side in this conflict may have such weapons.
That's not true. I just said yesterday that phosphorus shells were shot by Hamas from Gaza into Israel. That was documented yesterday. But let's be clear here. The UN is not our enemy. Our enemy is Hamas. Now, it would have been easier for us to carpet bomb this whole neighborhood to get rid of Hamas. We are risking the lives of our young servicemen using surgical military ground tactics to deal with Hamas military facilities. We are doing our utmost to avoid seeing innocent people getting caught up in the crossfire. We don't want to see innocent civilians. We don't want to see UN personnel. We don't want to see innocent civilians caught up in the crossfire. We've urged people to leave the area of combat. And I would like to remind you and the viewers, there are unfortunately too many examples of when we've warned civilians to leave a combat zone. Hamas has prevented them from doing so.
But given the very sensitive location of this United Nations relief compound, is there any way that you could perhaps have pulled back, bearing in mind that you were getting very, very close to firing upon it and perhaps maybe even ultimately firing into the compound?
We're trying to be as surgical as we can in a very difficult combat situation. That's why we've sent in our ground forces. That's why they're there fighting in the immediate vicinity of the UN facility. And we didn't attack from the air or just used artillery. We want to hit our enemy, which is Hamas. We don't want to see innocent civilians caught up in the crossfire. Let me be very frank about that. Now, the UN is claiming that they've been caught up in the crossfire. These complaints will be taken very seriously, and they'll be thoroughly investigated. But as I can only reiterate, every Israeli soldier going into combat receives specific instructions that UN facilities and UN personnel are not our targets.
Mr. Regev, while we've been talking, we have heard from the AFP Newswires agency that a hospital wing has been hit in Gaza and is currently on fire. Can you tell us anything about that?
I have no information on that. That report has just come out now. We've been working very closely with the International Committee of the Red Cross to facilitate the flow of medicines to medical institutions in Gaza. I saw there was a report today in the press, journalists who visited Palestinian hospitals saying there were enough supplies of medicines and support mechanisms. That is our mission, to help those humanitarian bodies like the Red Cross to complete their mandate. We want to help them serve the people of Gaza, who are ultimately not our enemy. We don't want to see the people of Gaza caught up in the crossfire.
Mr. Regev, why won't the Israeli government allow international journalists and reporters into Gaza?
We have been. Today, I think some 20 are going in embedded with our forces. It's obviously very difficult in a combat situation that's going on at the moment, and you can see today how complex the combat situation is to have the area open to journalists. What we're doing has precedence with the NATO actions both in Serbia and in Afghanistan to create a closed military zone. I'm hopeful that when the military situation stabilizes, that we will in fact be allowed to let journalists in more than they've been up until now.
But journalists and reporters that cover conflict zones and wars, they know the risks. Isn't it up to them to decide what the risks are, and if they choose to take them, then so be it?
I understand that, and I understand the frustration of the members of the press. There's a story here and they want to be there covering it. I fully do understand that. But what Israel is doing at the moment is perfectly consistent with what NATO did both in Serbia and in Afghanistan, where you close combat areas for military purposes. The military operation is difficult enough as it is without having journalists there in the middle. We'll hopefully be letting journalists in shortly when the military situation stabilizes.
Of course, I'm sure you're aware that this will allow the cynics to say that it's because you don't want the rest of the world seeing the heavy-handed approach you're taking in Gaza.
Exactly the opposite is true. You know, that terrible story last week about the UN facility, and Hamas was putting out propaganda saying that Israel deliberately targeted a UN facility for no good reason. You know, they called it an Israeli war crime. The very next day, two members of the international press, or I should say two international press agencies widely respected, both the Associated Press and the New York Times, reached that particular place. They investigated, and both of them corroborated the Israeli side, which said that there was Hamas military activity either inside the UN facility or immediately adjacent to. In either case, it was clear Hamas was using the UN facility as a human shield.